Frequent travelers, what is something you saw while traveling that was so scary you never went back? I went to an ayahuasca retreat in Peru. The retreat itself was amazing, and I would recommend it to everyone. It was held deep in the Amazon, and to get there, you either had to pay for a group bus or take a small motorbike taxi. No one was really willing to drive that far otherwise. After the retreat ended, I had a couple of extra days to relax before heading back to the States. The girl I bunked with also had some time, so we decided to go into Tarapoto, the nearest town, and explore. We shopped, ate, and toured a chocolate factory. She was staying in a hotel in town for an early morning flight, so I took a motorbike taxi back to the jungle alone. About halfway down the road, the driver stopped. A man holding an AR approached the cab and started questioning me, where I was going, what I was doing, all of that. I was completely alone, with the driver who had willingly stopped for this guy, and a man with a massive gun in the middle of the Amazon. I was beyond terrified. The whole ordeal lasted less than 5 minutes and ended with me paying the guy a toll of 10 sols, less than $8, though I am not sure of the exact conversion. The driver insisted I had to do it, so I did. Thankfully, we drove away. A few miles later, the driver stopped again, and I nearly had a heart attack. He said he had something to show me and told me to get out of the cab. I still do not know if that was the right decision, but I did. He led me to the edge of the road, where a cliff overlooked a breathtaking sight, the place where a smaller river violently and spectacularly smashed into the Amazon River. It was one of the most beautiful things I saw in Peru. We stood in silence, watching the rivers merge, before he safely took me back to the retreat. It was a terrifying ride, but damn, what a story. My sister, my mom, and I were almost trafficked. We are originally from the Balkans but live in Germany. After my parents divorced, my mom took us on a holiday back home. The bus ride was over 30 hours. We were almost there, and my uncle was supposed to pick us up at the station, but we never arrived. Around 11 p.m., the bus drivers claimed we had a flat tire in the middle of nowhere. Only 3 other women were left on the bus. They started crying when the drivers told us there were nice taxis waiting to take us home. Looking back, it made no sense. None of us lived in the same city. But my mom and sister had already gotten into one of the taxis, bags in the trunk. That is when the women started screaming and crying, desperately trying to call their husbands. Luckily, one of them had a husband who lived nearby. He showed up with his family, and suddenly, the bus drivers got scared. The taxis sped off. Long story short, we later found out that many women and girls had gone missing in recent months due to human trafficking. I have a house in both Nova Scotia and New York, and I drive between them about every other month. This happened around 3 a.m. while I was driving through Maine on my way back to Nova Scotia. It was snowing heavily, and I was in a very remote stretch of highway. I needed gas but hesitated to stop because of the weather. Eventually, I pulled into a gas station, filled up, grabbed a pack of cigarettes and a coffee, then stepped outside to smoke. Everything seemed normal, until I noticed 3 men sitting in a parked car, watching me. That spooked me a bit, so I stubbed out my cigarette in the snow, got in my car, and drove off. About 2 miles down the road, I saw headlights behind me. It was the same car. Shit, I was alone, and it was late. They slowly gained on me until they were right behind. At that point, I knew for sure they were following me. Then they bumped into my car. I pulled over, and so did they. All 3 got out and started walking toward me, hands in their pockets. They picked the wrong person. I grabbed my shotgun from the back, got out, and just stood there. They stopped, stared for a second, then turned around, got back in their car, and sped off. Afterward, I called the police, but the plate number I gave them was unregistered, so there was nothing they could do. That was probably the closest shave I have ever had. If I had not had that shotgun, I do not know what would have happened. It is not my story, but a close friend's. For high school graduation a few years back, my friend and about 20 other students planned a trip to Thailand. Everything was going great for days, until one night when they all went out to a local bar. At some point, one guy got up to use the washroom, and never came back. No one saw him leave. The bar patrons did not see anything. He vanished completely. This happened in 2014, and nothing has come of it since. In 2019, they got access to his cell phone records, but unfortunately, someone had manually turned his phone off that night. Technically, it is not about what my friend saw while she was there, but what she didn't see. Needless to say, she vowed never to go back. She still loves traveling, but she is incredibly careful about it now. Not exactly scary, but I definitely felt like I could have been kidnapped. There were some serious cult vibes in Jamestown, New York. Some friends and I were driving from Colorado to Vermont and stopped in Jamestown to stretch our legs. A group of kids around our age, early to mid-20s, started talking to us. They seemed cool, and we were always up for new experiences, so when they invited us over for donuts and coffee, we thought, hell yeah. But then they led us to a church basement. We did not want to be rude, so we stayed polite, chatted with the pastor, and thanked everyone for the donuts and conversation. Then we went to leave, but the same kids who brought us there followed us. They kept asking us to go back with them and just would not go away. Before heading out, I stopped at a gas station to use the bathroom. When I came out, one of them was just standing there, waiting for me. I do not know, something about the whole situation felt off. We got some weird looks from the locals too, so we jumped back in the car and got the hell out of there. Throughout high school, my friends and I would take trips to the South Texas desert near the border. We would camp in the wilderness, shoot guns, and build bonfires. We graduated in 2004. Our last trip was in 2005, and it turned into a terrifying experience. That night, we had a campfire going. For those who do not know, deserts get cold at night due to the lack of humidity, so we were huddled around the fire when three men suddenly emerged from the darkness and stepped into the firelight. No greeting, no small talk. The first guy, in very basic English, said, "You come with us." It was not a request. We politely declined. Another guy muttered something angrily in Spanish. The first man repeated, "Come with us," and stepped forward. My friend panicked, grabbed his shotgun, and screamed that we were not going anywhere. The English-speaking guy simply said, "Okay, stay," as he backed away. Then they left. We wasted no time. We put out the fire, grabbed our wallets and old flip phones, and ran for the car. As we drove off, we saw 3 sets of headlights moving over the flats. We killed our lights and drove in darkness until we lost them. We went straight to the sheriff's office to report what had happened. The officer told us that if our story was true, it was a real good thing we did not go with them. I guess mine doesn't compare to some people's stories, but it was one of the scariest things I've been through. I like to backpack, and I go with just my dog and me. Once, we were a week into a wilderness area in Colorado, just him and me. He got too close to the edge of a cliff, and his dumbass fell about 200 feet down. When I got to him, I realized his leg was completely snapped, among other injuries, and there was no way he'd be walking anytime soon. So I had a choice. Leave the dog and go get help, or carry the dog and leave the supplies. This was in late fall, by the way, when it gets well below freezing at night. I ended up strapping my tent and some food to my chest and carrying my 100-pound dog on my back for 3 days of absolute hell, the dog crying. I couldn't walk fast, he yelped every time I stumbled, we were cold and alone, and I thought we were gonna die. On the 3rd day, I ran into a couple. They warmed up some baked beans for us, made a stretcher out of their walking poles and a sleeping bag, and carried my dog all the way back to the trailhead. I honestly thought I was going to have to leave my dog and come back later to find him dead in the snow. The couple even retrieved my gear that I had left and brought it back to the city a couple of weeks later. People are amazing sometimes. My family lived in Mongolia for a couple of years when I was younger. During our 2nd year, we stayed in an apartment with all Mongolian families. The first year there were other American/foreign families in our building. One family in particular really disliked foreigners, and unfortunately, they lived directly above us. The 4 boys from that family would always urinate on our clothing that we hung out to dry on the balcony. Since dryers weren't common and, given that Mongolia is a desert, clothes dried very quickly. Those boys learned that my brother and I loved dogs. In Mongolia, at least in the early 90s when we were there, dogs were not typically seen as pets, and there were many roaming the streets. My brother and I would always pet them and play with them. One day, while we were playing in the yard in front of the apartment building, the boys brought us a puppy and let us play with it. We were pretty excited, being 8 and 6 years old, and enjoyed having the little companion. Then, in a shocking turn of events, the boys took the puppy from us and mistreated it so severely that it died. I don't remember this clearly, thankfully, but my mom says we were very upset. Mongolia isn't a bad place. I don't mean for anyone to get the wrong impression. It was just those boys who were incredibly mean. About 10 years ago, my wife and I were driving to Cape Cod from the Midwest. We had crossed into upstate New York when both of us needed a restroom break. I spotted a storefront with gas pumps, not a well-known brand like Shell, so we pulled off the highway. As we drove down the side road toward the station, we noticed 4 or 5 men standing out front, talking. The moment they saw us, they stopped and stared, watching us intently. Both of us immediately got a bad feeling. My wife has a strong intuition, she is slightly psychic, and I never doubt her instincts. But even without that, I could feel it. Something was off. As we turned around to get back on the highway, we realized that anything happening at that station would be completely hidden from view. There was nothing else around. We decided to hold it for a few more miles until we found a normal service station. Not me, but a friend of mine encountered some crazy shit while traveling in Taiwan. This was around Taichung. There were 4 of them, she, 2 other girls, and 1 guy. They hopped in a taxi and gave the driver the destination. He went the right way for a while, then abruptly pulled off onto a side road. As they continued driving, my friend asked him in Mandarin, "Where the hell are you going?" Because they had been to that place before and knew that wherever he was taking them now was not what they asked for. The driver said nothing, got on his cell phone, and spoke to someone on the other end in Taiwanese. None of the passengers understood this language. The mystery was how the driver figured this out, since they were all Asian and could have easily passed for natives visiting home for the holidays. The car pulled into an open field surrounded by trees in every direction, with only a single house in the middle of it. He parked right outside, and it appeared that people were emerging from the building, several of them. The driver paused for a brief second, started the car up again, and continued driving. A few minutes later, the group found themselves on the side of the main road as the cabbie drove off. What the 3 girls in the back of the car did not know at the time was that, upon stopping outside that house, the 4th member sitting up front pulled out his knife and held it right above his knee, making sure it was in plain view of the driver. Once the cabbie saw this, he started the car up again, no doubt realizing the dangerous situation he had inadvertently found himself in. They never figured out what the driver planned on doing, but anything even close to kidnapping couldn't have been good. The cabbie was reported to the authorities, but they left for the States before finding out anything further. From 1999 to 2002, I was traveling the Midwest and plains. I remember driving through an arid desert, which looked like it used to be farmland before the long-term drought in the area. My car broke down not far from a farm, and a very nice older couple let me stay with them until I could get my truck fixed in 2002. They had a wonderful dog that I really enjoyed playing with. Let me tell you though, the number of people that would come by this family's home was absolutely insane. A sickly-looking man kept harassing them to turn their property into a literal dump or landfill. There were 5 or 6 gangsters leaving large footprints on the more secluded areas of the property, burying God knows what, and an ancient-looking dude wanted to film on their property, not nursing home old, but crypt keeper old. As nice as their dog was, holy fucking shit, the 2 ducks they kept seemed to have a vendetta against everyone. At least there was a nice traveling barber service in the area. Got a real nice buzz cut. 6 years ago, I went hiking in Scotland with some friends. One night, we slept in tents in the middle of nowhere. In the middle of the night, I heard a sound like someone was eating something right next to the tent. I asked if any of my friends were awake. They slept in another tent, and one of them answered. When I asked if he heard that, he said yes, but he thought it was me making the noise. It wasn't. The eating noise eventually stopped, but then we heard something like stomach grumbling. This doesn't sound too scary when written down, but believe me, it was. Imagine being in a situation where civilization is just a day's walk away. We still puzzle over what it could have been, maybe just a sheep, since there are loads of them in Scotland. I'm a sucker for solo vacations. I went to visit Berlin for Christmas 2017 and got approached by a man with a very shitty, old cell phone. He asked me to take a picture of him. I didn't think anything of it, since it was 8 p.m. on Alexander Square and there were loads of people. I said, yeah, sure, and took his phone. What's weird about him was that he kept looking around but never smiled at the camera. He took one look at the photo, poor quality, of course, and said, "That's no good, let's go over there and take another one." Naive as I was, I followed him and then noticed that he was trying to take the second picture between two Christmas market stands, where it was rather dark and far away from the main crowd on Alexander Square. I remember thinking to myself, WTF, there's even less light here, and then I finally realized what was about to happen. I saw another guy coming out from between the two stands, both were poorly dressed, which isn't that common in Germany, and connected him to the first guy. Needless to say, I dropped the phone on the ground and ran back to the Christmas market crowd. I remember the pilot calling over the loudspeaker, "All right guys, looks like we have some seriously rough air coming up here," before the jet suddenly free fell. I was flying home from Jamaica when our plane hit an air pocket and free fell for about 3 seconds. It looked just like those videos of astronauts training on planes, with people and their food and drinks floating out of their seats. I was sitting by myself because we bought tickets late, and the girl next to me, about my age, clutched my arm like it was the only thing anchoring her to the plane. Then the masks deployed, and the pilot informed us that the plane hadn't lost pressure, but that we're not out of the woods yet. About 10 seconds later, we fell again, this time for about 4 seconds, and the lights went out on the plane. My arm had completely lost circulation because the girl still hadn't let go. I remember looking out the window, she was too preoccupied to close it, and seeing the wings bow upward, disappearing from view. I also recall a flight attendant strapping herself into a chair. She made the sign of the cross and bowed her head to pray, which was pretty scary. It was obviously a big deal. People always say you can tell how serious a situation on a plane is by looking at the stewardesses, and this was clearly one of those times. I sat there, overwhelmed by the sheer helplessness of the situation, terrified at the thought of dying alone. In that span of 30 seconds, I was hit with a rush of lofty thoughts. If this is truly the end, was my life meaningful? Did I honestly leave this world better than I found it? If there is a God, would he accept me? Would he accept the girl next to me? It was a lot to process in such a short time. The girl next to me was looking at me, crying, as if I held all the answers, and she asked, "Are we going to be okay?" I just shrugged my shoulders, trying to be as brave as I could under the circumstances. I remember the veins in my arm, past her hand, popping up from the lack of blood flow. Her hand was like a tourniquet, keeping the fear of death at bay. A few minutes later, it seemed we had passed the worst of the turbulence, and the girl kept holding my arm for the rest of the flight. Sometimes she'd loosen her grip, but the moment we felt the slightest bump, it was like a tourniquet all over again. I didn't say much about it. It was almost like when your little sister gets scared and grabs you. Nothing needed to be said. We landed, and I helped her gather her stuff because she was still shaking. I carried her belongings to baggage claim, got her bags when she pointed them out, and walked her to the exit. I don't think I ever said more than 10 words to her, but nothing needed to be said. It was like we shared a deep, unspoken connection, as if we were family. I still think about that girl and wonder if that event had as profound an effect on her life as it did on mine. When I was in Indonesia, I was walking from my guest house to grab dinner one night when a group of 4 men started catcalling and yelling what were probably inappropriate things at me. I just ignored them and walked very quickly into the nearest building, which was like a department store. They followed me in, and I tried to ignore them, hoping they'd leave. I figured I was safer in a public, well-lit place. Then they grabbed me, and I spun around and started screaming at them, in English, so they probably didn't understand, but I reckon they got the feeling. They laughed but eventually left. The worst part was that all the people in the department store, including other women working there, just giggled when they saw what was happening. Those men probably could have dragged me out of the store, and no one would have done anything. I left Indonesia the next morning. I was living in Cape Town, South Africa. My wife and I had been there for a few weeks and decided to take a combi taxi to a neighboring suburb to get dinner. Unaware that every road with a rail stop was called Station Road, we ended up getting off at the wrong street. The taxi driver, recognizing we weren't locals, told us we were in the wrong neighborhood and should take a taxi back the other way. Figuring it was no big deal, after all, it was 5 p.m. and still very light, we started walking down a one-way street. The street was like something out of a movie. Bags of trash rolling like tumbleweeds, a shirtless kid with a toy machine gun shooting at us and then running inside, and 2 guys approaching us from the front with 3 more coming from behind. Trying to be inconspicuous and thinking that being poor doesn't mean you're dangerous, we pressed on, trying not to look like victims. Suddenly, I heard a car accelerate behind us and skid. I turned around and saw a man trying to run down the guys chasing us. He was a 45-year-old Indian man driving a new Corolla the wrong way down the one-way street. He pulled up alongside us and said, "Get in the car, these guys are going to rob you." I looked around, and it suddenly all clicked. I hedged my bets and jumped in the car with him. He explained that as he was driving down the main road, he saw us walking and noticed the group splitting off to ambush us, so he turned around to help. It took a while to sink in, and I still don't like to think about it, but knowing friends who got beaten and abused, I realized that we probably weren't going to walk away. My wife was likely going to be attacked, and I was probably going to be shot. Even though it was daytime, we were essentially alone on a secluded street. That man saved my life and my wife's. I could never thank him enough, and I only wish he knew how much I appreciate it. Not exactly scary, but definitely unnerving. It was summer 2011, and I was on a school trip to Portugal. I was around 16 or 17 at the time. That morning, we were sightseeing and waiting for a bus around 6 or 7 a.m. A group of visibly drunk men staggered toward us, clearly still out from the night before. They looked rough, possibly homeless, or just the type who did not care to shower. They sat on the curb a few feet away and started catcalling one of the girls on our trip. Our teacher quickly stepped in, shouting back that she was a minor and telling them to go home and sleep it off. We did not want any trouble. That pissed them off. They immediately got up and staggered toward us. One went for our teacher, swearing and yelling unintelligibly, while the other 2 moved toward the student they had been harassing. To her credit, she stood her ground, telling them to fuck off. But before they could get close, a bunch of the guys in our group stepped in front of her. Then came the moment, the one everyone later said was when shit got serious. Our wise, zen, old philosophy teacher, known for his calm demeanor, suddenly shoved his very expensive, beloved camera into a student's hands, muttered, "Hold this," and went chest to chest with the guy, screaming right back at him. Then everything happened at once. The other 2 men moved to back up their friend, prompting half of the boys in our group to step forward in defense of their teacher. Our geography teacher freaked out and tried to pull the philosophy teacher away while a few older boys helped. The student with the camera immediately ran as far away as possible, knowing he held a priceless artifact. And then, the bus pulled up. Sensing the situation, the social studies teacher started ushering students on as fast as possible. Meanwhile, the bus driver got off the bus, pulled a baton out of nowhere, and started waving it around, yelling in Portuguese. That was enough to break up most of the fight. The 2 drunk guys backed off, the male students loaded onto the bus, and the geography teacher physically dragged the philosophy teacher away from the standoff. Even after we were safely inside, the men continued slapping the side of the bus and yelling at us, until the driver just drove off, leaving them stumbling in the dust. The whole bus was in shock. Half the girls were crying, the boys were boasting about how they would have kicked their asses, and the philosophy teacher finally calmed down enough to ask, "Who the hell has my camera?" Honestly, I had kind of forgotten about this memory. We still had a blast in Lisbon. I did get conned into buying a $20 bracelet and impulsively bought a trumpet just because I could afford it. My friend also puked on the train from being severely hungover. Good times. Not me, but my dad. He used to be a professional photographer, one of those types who would do anything for a good photo. Anyway, he's in Mexico on a business trip. During some time off, he rents a car and goes outside the city looking for good pictures. He sees some young children playing in the street and starts taking pictures of them. A few minutes later, men and women start shouting and running toward him. He jumps back in his car, but they surround it. More villagers arrive, and soon there's a mob around his car. They're screaming, beating on the windows, and trying to overturn his car. Moments later, the police arrive and he's arrested, and in doing so, they probably save his life. They take him to the station and interrogate him. He tells them he's just a photographer from America taking pictures as a tourist. Obviously, he's as confused as you can imagine and scared shitless. The police believe him and then tell him that a gang or cartel has been in town taking pictures of children and then kidnapping them. The villagers thought he was part of the gang. Camped for a week on an island in Panama with 2 buddies. We stayed with a jungle man and literally lived off the land, ate iguana, drank rainwater, etc. Another story. When we were dropped off by a local, he told us to walk a few miles that way, and we'd find the jungle man to camp with until he came back in a week. A week went by, it was incredible, and then our guy showed up to take us back. It was storming and the surf was up. He had brought a really disheveled dude with him in his canoe with a motor, and the four of us boarded with our packs and set out into the ocean. It was fucking nuts. First, we had to get through the breaking waves from the beach, big fucking waves. We made it with the help of a disheveled spotter who pointed left or right to navigate through the breakers with our crappy 5-horsepower canoe and the four of us. Okay, now we're a kilometer out to sea in big surf, riding the troughs and dips of the ocean, and thinking about the tiger sharks that were surely waiting to take us when we capsize. As we headed into a harbor, we saw a gigantic barrel wave off a point about 100 meters away, a surfer's dream. I looked back and everyone was white with fear. We thought, we're going to die. As we entered the harbor, we were riding the waves in. If we went too straight, the canoe would surf down the wave and dig its nose in, and again, we all would die. The boys held their packs with a death grip, trying not to freak the fuck out. About 10 minutes later, we approached a wharf with a small group of locals who were literally cheering our return. They hugged us when we got off the boat because they thought we were goners in that weather. We all nearly collapsed. It turned out that the disheveled guy was just the town crazy, the only one who would volunteer to go with our guy to get us. Thailand, Pai. When I was dating my girlfriend, we went there. Pai is sort of an out-in-the-nowhere spot, popular with hippie hipster tourists. They even shot some famous Asian movies in this village, so despite its remote location, it was still pretty popular. The first thing we noticed was the insane number of stray dogs, about 20 dogs everywhere. They'd just wander into restaurants begging for food, etc. They were all super friendly and chill. While we were there, a huge reggae event was happening. We went, and it lasted until around 2 a.m. Since it was far out in the fields, you had to catch a shuttle bus to get back into the village. After the event, when we returned to the village, we couldn't find where we parked our scooter. It was scary searching for your bike in the middle of the night with a lot of dogs following us and just watching. When we finally found the scooter and drove back to our resort, something really strange happened. We saw a lady in the middle of the road at around 3 or 4 a.m. She was dressed in a long black dress with long black hair, standing in the middle of the road we had to pass to get to the resort. She was flailing her arms around but didn't move her feet at all. Around her, about 30 dogs formed a circle, barking like crazy, but none of them went near her. I thought I must have been seeing things, but my girlfriend saw it too. I told her to keep driving and not to stop. The resort was nearby, so we wanted to warn them, thinking maybe someone needed help. But for some reason, there was nobody around. The barking eventually stopped, and we decided to head to our room and try to sleep. Well, that wasn't the end. Over the night, we heard someone knocking on our door and window every now and then. We also heard the distant barking from outside the gate, and it just continued. The next day, we decided to get the fuck out of that town, but every bus was full because of the reggae event. I ended up paying a driver, who approached us for a private ride at 4 times the price, just to get out of there. To this day, we still don't know what it was about. I feel awful thinking it might have been a lady who was really in need of help, but every alarm went off in my head, and I think it was a good call to keep driving. I hope. I traveled to Paris when I was 17 with a group of high school students. We were told to keep our money safely packed away and to never engage with the street vendors, especially those who make bracelets on tourists' wrists. These men create bracelets and then charge exorbitant fees. If you refuse, they will threaten you or physically prevent you from leaving the area. I was paired with another young girl when we were heading to the Sacré-Cœur, and a man approached us wanting to make a bracelet. We declined, but he wouldn't take no for an answer. He kept bothering us and following us up the hill despite our repeated refusals. At one point, he grabbed my wrist and began trying to put the bracelet on. I clutched my friend as he pulled me in the opposite direction. The man started screaming at me and pulling me harder, and I wasn't sure what to do. My friend began screaming for the police, and eventually the man took off. Unfortunately, a similar incident happened with another student who didn't realize that the man wasn't going to let him leave without paying 20 euros. When that student tried to leave, the man threatened to follow him and cause serious harm to him and his family, along with all sorts of terrible things. The student managed to take a picture of the man, but the man snatched his camera and fled. Tourist destinations can be really unpredictable. It wasn't actually that scary, but I was on a train from Germany into Prague, en route to Budapest, when the train was stopped by the military or police at Bad Schandau, a small town near the border. Officers came on the train, asked for our passports, and then selectively ejected people from the train, myself included. A bunch of us had to walk to the local train station and book new trips without passing through the Czech Republic. I remember walking past some soldiers and saying hi. One uniformed guy looked at me with what I interpreted as a, "You silly innocent little hippie," kind of look. Turns out there was a large political summit in Prague in the next couple of weeks that I wasn't aware of, and they were keeping Westerners out, presuming that they were going to protest. It all worked out, though it added some extra travel time on the train, which was fine, and now it makes for a good story. Another time, when I visited Ukraine and Russia, Kiev and Moscow, respectively, a customs officer gave me a tiny, unofficial slip of paper with a stamp on it when I entered Ukraine. I shrugged and put it in the back of my camera bag. A few days later, on the overnight train to Moscow somewhere along the Ukraine/Russian border, we were woken up at the border by customs agents who wanted to see our papers. I had a couple of Russian friends with me to help with translation. The officers were asking for some specific document. I kept digging through my stuff, showing them things, saying, this. My Russian friends were translating back and forth, and the agents were getting increasingly agitated, with other officers closing in. This was 3 a.m. on a train after being woken up, mind you. My friends pleaded with me in English and tried to placate the officers, who were becoming aggressive. Finally, on a whim, I pulled out that tiny slip of paper and handed it to them. Suddenly, everything calmed down. The officers stamped my passport and moved on. That was it. We were all pretty frazzled afterward. I still don't know why that little piece of paper was so important, but I'm glad I kept it. On a side note, while traveling through Europe I quickly learned this. When people in uniform approach you on trains, if they don't have a gun, show them your train ticket. If they do have a gun, show them your passport and customs documents.